In 1930, 13 teams boarded 13 teams, some sailing for over 2 weeks, just to play in a tournament nobody outside South America had ever heard of. There was no trophy ceremony broadcast to billions, no sponsorship logos, no global anthem playing before kickoff. Just a stadium in Montevideo, a few thousand fans, and a question nobody could answer yet. Would anyone care? Today, the World Cup is the single most watched event on Earth. Over 3.5 billion people tuned in for the 2018 final alone. It's bigger than any movie premiere, any royal wedding, any presidential inauguration. But here's what almost nobody realizes. The World Cup wasn't designed to become this. It became this almost by accident. And the real story of how it happened isn't about talent, or passion, or even soccer itself. It's about something far less romantic and far more revealing. It wasn't the players who built the World Cup into a global obsession. It was the system around them, quietly, slowly, reshaping the game until the tournament we watch today barely resembles the one that started it all. Let's start with something almost nobody talks about. For the first several decades of its existence, the World Cup wasn't even built for professionals. In the early 20th century, soccer, like the Olympics, was wrapped in a strange obsession with amateurism. The idea was that playing for money was somehow impure, beneath the spirit of competition. Many of the best players in the world weren't allowed to compete in major tournaments because they earned a wage from the sport. It sounds almost unthinkable now. Today, players sign contracts worth hundreds of millions, but back then, getting paid to play could disqualify you. It wasn't about fairness. It was about preserving an old-world class structure where sport was supposed to be a gentleman's hobby, not a profession for the working class. And that single belief shaped which countries could even field competitive teams. Then there's geography, something so simple it's easy to overlook, but it changed everything. In the early tournaments, travel wasn't just inconvenient, it was brutal. Teams from Europe had to cross the Atlantic by boat to reach South America, a journey that could take over 2 weeks each way. Some teams simply couldn't afford it. Others pulled out entirely. This wasn't a tournament of the world's best teams. It was a tournament of whichever teams could physically show up. And that detail alone explains why early World Cups look so different from what we expect today. It wasn't talent that was missing, it was access. Now here's where the story gets interesting, because the next major shift wasn't about the players, or even the teams. It was about a tiny piece of technology sitting in living rooms, the television. Before TV, the World Cup was a regional spectacle, experienced through radio and newspaper headlines. People who weren't there simply didn't see it. But once television entered homes in the 1950s and 60s, something changed permanently. Soccer wasn't just something you played, it was something you watched together, as a family, as a neighborhood, as a nation. And the moment television got involved, the tournament stopped being just a sporting event. It became a shared experience, a cultural ritual, the kind of thing that united strangers around a single screen for 90 minutes. It wasn't intentional, it was automatic. Once people could see the game, they couldn't look away. But television didn't just change how people watched the World Cup, it changed who controlled it. Because suddenly broadcasting rights were worth money, a lot of money, and wherever there's money, there's power shifting hands. FIFA, which had once been a relatively modest organization overseeing amateur ideals, transformed into something closer to a global business. By the 1970s and 80s, under new leadership, the World Cup expanded rapidly, not just in skill level, but in scale. More teams, more countries, more continents represented. On the surface, this looked like growth for the sake of inclusion. But look closer, and you'll see the real driver. Each new country added meant new television markets, new sponsorship deals, new advertising revenue. It wasn't charity, it was strategy disguised as global unity. And this is where the contrast with today becomes impossible to ignore. We tend to imagine that the World Cup grew because the love of the game spread naturally across the world. But in reality, it grew because someone realized that love could be monetized at scale. The passion was real, but the expansion of that passion was engineered. Every 4 years, more sponsors arrived, more countries got broadcasting deals, more households gained access to the spectacle. The tournament didn't just grow in popularity, it grew in infrastructure. Stadiums became architectural statements. Host countries spent billions, not millions, competing not just for the trophy, but for the prestige of hosting the world's attention. Qatar spent over $200 billion preparing for the 2022 tournament. Let that number sink in for a second. Not because it's shocking on its own, but because it shows just how far the tournament drifted from its modest amateur origins. What started as a handful of teams crossing oceans for the love of competition became a multi-billion-dollar global production engineered for maximum reach. Here's the part that really challenges what we assume. We like to believe the World Cup became massive because soccer is simply the world's most beloved sport, and in some sense that's true, but it's not the whole truth. The tournament's growth wasn't driven by passion alone, it was driven by access. Television gave people access to watch. Expansion gave more countries access to compete. Sponsorship gave corporations access to billions of eyeballs. Every layer of growth was in some way about expanding who could participate, whether as a player, a viewer, or a brand. And once access expanded, passion followed naturally. It wasn't that people suddenly loved the Bing more, it's that more people were finally let in. This is where it gets a little uncomfortable if you really sit with it. Because if growth was driven by access and infrastructure rather than pure passion, that means something deeper. The same forces that built the modern World Cup could in theory reshape it again, and in some ways they already have. The introduction of VAR, Video Assistant Referee, wasn't born from fans demanding more pauses in play. It came from a desire for precision, for control, for minimizing controversy in an era where every decision is replayed in slow motion by millions of viewers in real time. The expanded 48-team format for future tournaments wasn't a grassroots demand either. It was once again a calculated move. More games, more broadcasts, more revenue streams. None of this is necessarily bad, but it reveals something most fans don't want to admit. The World Cup we watch today isn't simply an evolution of passion, it's an evolution of systems, broadcasting systems, economic systems, political systems, all quietly shaping the game from behind the curtain. So when we zoom out, the real story of the World Cup isn't really about soccer at all. It's about how a regional tournament built on amateur ideals and limited by geography slowly became one of the most powerful cultural and economic forces on the planet, not because people decided to make it that way, but because every technological and financial shift nudged it there, one decision at a time. It wasn't a single moment of transformation, it was 1,000 small ones, stacking quietly across nearly a century. And maybe that's the part that's hardest to accept. The things we experience as pure tradition, the anthem before kickoff, the global broadcast, the sense that the whole world is watching, aren't ancient, they're recent, manufactured in a sense, by forces most of us never think about. The passion is real, but the machine behind it was built piece by piece, by people chasing something far less poetic than glory. So the next time you watch the World Cup final, and you feel that wave of connection, millions of strangers united by one ball and 90 minutes, remember this, that feeling wasn't an accident of culture. It was, in many ways, designed. Not the emotion itself, but the system that made sure billions of people would be in front of a screen to feel it together. And once you see that, you can't really unsee it. The World Cup didn't just grow, it was engineered to grow, and in some quiet way, that engineering shaped how an entire planet learned to feel the same emotion at the exact same moment every 4 years.